Welcome to our deep dive into intelligence tests. You sent us a really interesting bunch of articles and research on this.
Yeah,
And we are excited to dig into it all with you today.
that's gonna be fun.
We're going to be exploring all sorts of things, like different theories of intelligence,
Right.
how these tests are actually made,
Mm-hmm.
and, of course, some of the controversies that always seem to pop up around them.
There are a lot.
There are.
Yeah, it's a really complex topic, and I think getting a good grasp of all the little details
Right.
is really important because it's something so personal,
It is?
intelligence.
Yeah. I think for a lot of people, you hear IQ test, and you just feel like
Yeah.
you're about to be judged,
Totally.
Like a number is going to sum up your entire worth as a human being.
Yeah, it's a common reaction, but it's actually a pretty big misconception.
Okay.
You can think of IQ scores more as a prediction of how well you might do in a traditional school setting, like an aptitude test.
So not some all-encompassing measure of how intelligent you are.
Exactly. They're really focused on measuring specific skills,
Okay.
things like verbal and math knowledge or problem solving,
Mm-hmm.
analytical thinking and information processing,
Okay.
memory comprehension,
So basically all the things that make for getting good grades.
pretty much.
And they're actually pretty good at predicting that academic success.
Oh yeah, there's a definite correlation between IQ scores and how someone performs in school.
Huh.
It's called criterion-based validity.
Okay.
Basically, the test does a good job of measuring what it's supposed to.
So it's valid in that sense.
Yes.
Okay, but that brings us to the big question, doesn't it?
What is intelligence?
Yeah, what is intelligence, really?
Mhm.
Is it just about being good at tests and, being book smart, or is there more to it?
Well, things get really interesting here because intelligence is what we call a construct.
Okay.
We can't actually see it, but we can see how it impacts behavior.
Mm-hmm.
Psychologist David Wechsler defined intelligence as the global capacity to act purposefully, think rationally, and effectively navigate your environment.
So you're talking about adaptability and real-world problem solving.
Exactly. It's not just about memorizing facts from a textbook.
Right. So that goes beyond that.
It does, and this is where the big debate comes in.
Okay.
Is there one single general intelligence,
Yeah.
like Spearman's G factor that basically fuels all intelligent behavior?
Okay.
Or is it more like a collection of specific abilities,
Uh-huh.
like Thurstone's primary mental abilities? Things like verbal fluency,
Mm-hmm.
spatial visualization, or how quickly you process information.
So it's like some people think there's one master intelligence and others think it's more like a toolbox full of different skills.
That's a great way to put it.
Okay.
And to try to figure this out, researchers use this technique called a factor analysis.
Okay.
Imagine trying to figure out if you have one giant engine powering your intelligence
Mm-hmm.
or lots of smaller specialized ones.
Okay.
That's kind of what factor analysis helps researchers do.
It's really interesting because, you hear people talk about book smarts versus street smarts.
Right.
Is there any science behind that idea?
There is. The Horn-Cattell model talks about crystallized intelligence.
Okay.
That's all your accumulated knowledge,
Hmm.
like your book smarts.
Okay.
And then there's fluid intelligence, which is more about how you solve new problems and adapt to new situations.
So that's more your street smarts. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yep.
Crystallized intelligence is like all the information you've got stored away in your mental library.
Huh.
All those facts and figures.
Right.
And fluid intelligence is how you use that library to solve problems and think on your feet.
So it's like one is the information and the other is how you actually use that information.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And this model is popular because it shows how intelligence isn't just one thing.
Yeah.
There's also this thing called the Cattell-Horn-Carroll theory.
Mm-hmm.
It's a bit more expanded, and it does include that general intelligence factor, or G, but it still acknowledges all these distinct abilities.
So like some researchers think there's this overall capacity for learning,
Yes.
but then everyone also has specific strengths in different areas.
Exactly. And then Robert Sternberg's triarchic theory adds another layer to all of this.
Okay.
His theory really emphasizes how your intelligence interacts with your environment.
Interesting.
It says there are three main parts:
Okay.
componential, experiential, and contextual.
So it's not just about what's happening in your head, but also how you interact with the world around you.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Componential intelligence is your analytical thinking skills.
Okay.
The what you know part.
Right.
Experiential intelligence is all about creativity and insight.
Mm-hmm.
That's the what you do.
Okay.
And then contextual intelligence is your practical street smarts, the how you behave.
So thinking about our listener, you might be amazing at those traditional tests, the componential intelligence.
Right.
But you might also be really great at coming up with creative solutions to problems that's experiential.
Exactly.
And maybe you're really good at navigating social situations,
Yes.
which is contextual.
That's valuable intelligence, too.
It is.
Sternberg actually argues that intelligence is about adapting to your environment,
Hmm.
finding environments that work for you,
Okay.
and even shaping your environment to fit your needs.
So it's a much broader view than just how you perform on a test.
Exactly. It's about how you function in the real world.
Okay, so we've got general intelligence, we've got these multiple intelligences,
Right.
we've got this idea of how you interact with your environment.
Mm.
So where does Howard Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences fit into all of this?
Well, Gardner kind of goes in a completely different direction.
Okay.
He proposes that there are 8 distinct intelligences. 8. Yes. Musical, bodily, kinesthetic, logical, mathematical, linguistic, spatial, intrapersonal, and naturalist.
Wow, that's a lot.
It is.
So you could be like a gifted musician, but have a really hard time with, say, spatial reasoning?
That's exactly his point.
Okay.
Gardner believes that everyone has all 8 of these intelligences, but we excel in some more than others.
So it's about recognizing those individual strengths.
Precisely.
It makes you think about how all those different types of intelligence are valuable in different
Oh,
professions.
absolutely.
Like a musician might have high musical intelligence,
Of course.
but a surgeon might have really strong bodily kinesthetic intelligence.
Right. Different skills for different fields.
And then we have Daniel Goleman, who introduced the concept of emotional intelligence.
Yes.
You hear so much about emotional intelligence these days.
It's become really important.
It seems like people are really starting to see how crucial it is for success,
Oh, for sure.
both personally and professionally.
Absolutely. Goleman actually argues that emotional intelligence can be even more important than IQ.
Really?
Yeah, when it comes to navigating the real world.
Wow.
Things like self-awareness, empathy, motivation, and social skills all play a part.
So even if you're not a math genius or a language whiz,
Yeah.
you can still thrive if you have a high level of emotional intelligence.
Exactly. You can achieve great things.
Okay, so we've got general intelligence, we've got multiple intelligences, we've got this interplay between you and your environment, and then we've got emotional intelligence.
It's a lot to consider.
It is. And all of these theories have shaped how we think about and assess intelligence.
Sure.
But they've also sparked quite a bit of debate.
Oh, absolutely.
What kind of controversies are we talking about?
Well, one of the big ones is cultural bias in these tests.
Uh-huh.
Historically, these tests were developed mostly by white males,
Okay.
and often the content reflects their backgrounds and their experiences.
So if you're from a different cultural background,
Right.
or you haven't had the same educational opportunities, you might be at a disadvantage when taking these tests.
Exactly.
That makes sense.
It brings up a lot of questions about fairness and equity, and it's a really important thing to keep in mind.
Yeah, because these tests aren't perfect, and they don't capture the full complexity of what human intelligence really is.
Absolutely.
So we have to be careful about how we interpret and use the results.
Absolutely. You have to use them responsibly and ethically.
Okay, well, this overview of all the theories behind intelligence testing has been super fascinating.
It's a lot to take in.
It is. Now let's zoom in a little and take a closer look at a test that a lot of people have heard of.
Okay.
The Stanford Binet.
Yes, the Stanford Binet.
Iconic.
It is, and understanding how it's changed over time can give us a lot of insight into the evolution of intelligence testing in general.
Okay, so let's rewind the clock and see where this all began.
Let's do it.
Okay.
It all started in Paris in the early 1900s with Alfred Binet and Theodore Simon.
Okay.
They were given this task of creating a test to identify students who might struggle in school.
So right from the beginning, the goal was to predict how well someone would do academically.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they actually worked with Jean Piaget on this.
Wait, Piaget was involved?
He was.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Because he had a really unique perspective on intelligence.
He did. Piaget was all about intention.
Okay.
He believed that intelligent acts were those that were intentional.
Interesting.
So it wasn't just about the cognitive skills themselves, but about the underlying goals and the motivations behind the behavior.
So it's about having a purpose and then acting on it.
Exactly. It's a very different way of looking at it.
It is. So Binet and Simon, their test.
Yes,
This was the very first intelligence test.
it was.
And it was designed to identify children who were...
Well, the term they used back then was mentally retarded,
Right.
which is obviously very outdated and offensive today.
Yeah, the language around all of this has definitely evolved.
It really has.
But their focus was on finding kids who might need some extra help in school.
Exactly.
And that's where this concept of mental age came in, right?
Yes.
How did that work?
The idea is that children of different ages have different cognitive abilities. So you would compare a child's performance on the test to the average performance of kids of different chronological ages.
So like if a 7-year-old performs like an average 10-year-old,
Yes.
their mental age would be 10.
Exactly. And that led to the development of the intelligence quotient, or IQ,
Okay.
which is calculated by dividing the mental age by the chronological age and then multiplying by 100.
So an IQ of 100 basically means that a child's mental age matches their actual age.
Right.
Okay.
But this way of calculating IQ did have some limitations, and eventually a new system was needed.
But the term IQ definitely stuck around.
Oh, yeah.
And it's still the most common way to talk about intelligence test results.
It is. So let's fast forward to today.
Okay.
What does the Stanford Binet look like now?
Yeah, tell me about the modern version of the test.
Well, it's been through a lot of revisions.
It has.
It's now in its 5th edition, the ST5.
Okay.
And it can be used to assess people from age 2 all the way up to 85 and older.
Wow, that's a huge range.
It is.
What's different about the SB5?
One big change is that it's moved away from just giving a single overall IQ score.
Okay.
Instead, the SB5 looks at 5 different factors.
Okay.
Fluid reasoning knowledge, quantitative reasoning, visual spatial processing, and working memory.
So it gives you a much more nuanced picture of someone's strengths and weaknesses.
Exactly. And each of those factors is measured by 2 subtests.
Okay.
So there's a total of 10 subtests.
Wow.
So you get a really detailed profile of a person's cognitive abilities.
It seems like the Stanford Binet has come a long way.
It has. It really reflects how much we've learned about intelligence.
Right. And with each revision, they've tried to make it more fair and reduce cultural bias.
That's right.
Can you give us some examples of how they've done that?
Well, one way is to involve a really diverse group of people in the process of norming the test.
Okay.
So that means making sure that the scores accurately reflect the abilities of a much wider range of people.
So they're making sure it's not biased towards one particular group.
Exactly. And they use these statistical techniques to try to spot questions that might be biased. For example, if one group consistently answers a question correctly, but another group consistently gets it wrong,
Yeah.
that could indicate that there's some cultural bias baked into the question.
Right. That makes sense.
So they're trying to remove those questions.
It sounds like a lot of work goes into making sure that the SB5 is fair.
It does. And there's always room for improvement.
Of course.
But the developers are constantly working to make sure that it's valid and reliable for everyone.
So how is the Stanford Binet actually given?
Good question.
I've heard that it uses a unique approach to finding the right level of difficulty for each person.
It does. They use something called adaptive testing.
Okay.
So the examiner starts by asking questions that are appropriate for the person's age.
So it's not like everyone gets the exact same test.
Right. They adjust the difficulty as they go based on how the person's doing.
Okay.
If they're answering correctly, they'll move to a harder question. But if they get it wrong, the questions will get a bit easier.
So it kind of tailors itself to the person as it's going along.
Exactly. The goal is to find what's called the person's basal age and their ceiling age.
What are those?
The basal age is the lowest point where the person is consistently answering the questions correctly.
Okay.
And the ceiling age is the point where they consistently start missing answers.
So you're trying to find that sweet spot where it's not too easy and not too hard.
Exactly. Once you find those points, the test ends and you use the number of correct answers to calculate a raw score. And then you convert that raw score into a standardized score based on the person's age.
So it's not just how many questions you get right, but how your answers compare to other people your age.
Exactly. And that's because the Stanford Binet is what we call a standardized test.
Okay.
Which means it's carefully designed to make sure that the scores are reliable and that they actually mean something.
Okay, well, we've talked about the history of the Stanford Binet, how it's changed over time and how it's given.
We have.
Now let's dive into these concepts of validity and reliability.
Okay, let's do it.
So when we're talking about the validity of an intelligence test, what are we really asking?
We're basically asking, does this test really measure what it claims to measure? And with intelligence, that question is tricky.
Okay.
Because intelligence itself is such a complex thing.
Right. It's not like measuring someone's height or weight.
Exactly.
There's no one agreed upon definition.
There isn't.
And different theories emphasize different aspects of intelligence, as we've already talked about.
Yes.
So the validity of a test depends on how well it aligns with the definition of intelligence that it's using.
Precisely.
And I guess that's why there's no one perfect intelligence test.
There isn't. Every test has its own strengths and weaknesses based on the theory that it's grounded in.
Yeah, you have to understand the theory behind it before you can even use it.
Absolutely.
Okay, so what about reliability?
Reliability is all about consistency. A reliable test will give you similar scores for the same person if they take it multiple times.
So, like, if I take the Stanford Binet today, and then I take it again next week, my score should be pretty close.
Ideally, yes. Of course, there will always be some variation in test scores,
Sure.
but a reliable test will keep that variation as small as possible.
Okay, but why is reliability so important when it comes to intelligence tests specifically?
Well, because they're often used to make big decisions about people's lives.
Like what?
Things like figuring out if someone's eligible for special education services
Oh, right.
or identifying gifted students.
So if the test isn't reliable, those decisions could be based on inaccurate information.
Exactly.
And that's not good.
No, it's not. So that's why they test these tests rigorously for reliability.
Okay, how do they do that?
There are a couple of different methods.
Okay.
One common one is test-retest reliability,
Okay.
where you give the same test to the same group of people twice, and then you calculate the correlation between those two sets of scores.
So if there's a strong correlation, that means the test is reliable.
Exactly. And another method is called internal consistency reliability, which looks at how strongly the questions on the test correlate with each other.
So if all the questions are measuring the same underlying thing,
Yeah.
then they should be highly correlated.
Exactly.
Okay.
Now, intelligence tests usually have really good internal consistency reliability
Why is that?
because they're often made up of several different subtests.
Right.
And those subtests are designed to measure different aspects of intelligence.
So the fact that they're so comprehensive actually helps with the reliability.
It does. And because intelligence is considered a stable trait, these tests also have to have good test-retest reliability. Your score in 3rd grade should be pretty similar to your score in 11th grade.
So if you see a big difference between scores, that could be a red flag.
It could be. There might be other factors influencing the score, of course.
Okay.
Things like test anxiety or changes in someone's health or their educational opportunities.
Okay.
But a huge difference in scores definitely warrants a closer look.
Okay, so we've talked about validity and we've talked about reliability.
Yes.
But there's another issue that we need to address.
What's that?
The misuse of these test scores.
Yes, this is a really important point.
It is. These tests can be really valuable,
They can.
but they can also be misinterpreted and misused.
Absolutely.
What are some examples of how that's happened in the past?
One of the biggest concerns is that they've been used to support discrimination and prejudice. Especially in the early 20th century, they were used to justify some really harmful policies.
Really?
Oh, yeah. Things like racist and eugenicist policies.
That's terrible. How could these tests be used to support those kinds of beliefs?
Well, unfortunately, there was this widespread belief back then that intelligence was mostly determined by your genes, and that certain racial and ethnic groups were just inherently less intelligent than others.
So they use these tests to reinforce those prejudices and basically create this hierarchy of intelligence based on race.
Exactly. It was a very distorted and harmful way of thinking.
And it led to some awful policies.
It did. Things like forced sterilization.
Wow.
And immigration restrictions targeted at groups that were considered feeble-minded.
It's a really dark part of the history of intelligence testing.
It is, and it's a reminder that we always have to be very careful and responsible when we're using these tests.
Right. We can't let them be used to justify discrimination or limit opportunities for anyone.
Absolutely.
And, Stephen Jay Gould in his book, The Mismeasure of Man,
Yes.
he really argues that IQ scores have been misused to put people in categories.
He does.
And that's led to the unfair treatment of certain groups.
That's right. And he gives lots of examples of how these scores have been used to support racist and classist ideologies.
Can you give us an example?
Sure. He talks about Eastern European immigrants who came to the United States in the early 1900s.
Good.
When they arrived, they were given intelligence tests. But many of them failed those tests simply because they didn't speak English.
Wow.
Which was the language that the tests were given in.
So they were being judged on their ability to speak English.
Exactly.
Not on their actual intelligence and
Right.
what happened to them.
Tragically, many of them were labeled as feeble-minded, and they were denied entry into the country.
It's awful.
It is, and many of them were sent back to their home countries where they faced persecution or even death.
Wow. That's a really stark reminder of the dangers of using these tests without taking into account the cultural and linguistic background of the person taking it.
It is. It's a really important thing to consider.
Yeah, imagine being denied entry to a country because you couldn't pass an IQ test in a language you didn't even speak.
It's a heartbreaking thought.
It is.
And it's a reminder that these tests can be manipulated to serve agendas that are really harmful. We have to remember that intelligence tests are just one tool. They can be helpful, but they should never be the sole basis for making decisions about someone's life.
Okay, well, this has been a really insightful look at the world of intelligence testing so far.
It has.
We've explored all sorts of theories.
Yeah.
We've delved into the history and the details of the Stanford Binet.
Right.
And we've started to touch on some of the ethical considerations that are really important to keep in mind.
It's a lot to think about.
It is.
Yeah.
And I think one of the key takeaways here is that intelligence is not a single fixed thing.
That's so important to remember.
It is.
It's complex, it's multifaceted, it involves a whole range of different cognitive abilities.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And our understanding of it is constantly evolving as we learn more about the brain and how we think.
Absolutely. It's a fascinating journey.
It is. So stay tuned because there's so much more to explore.
There is. We're just getting started.
We are.
And as we discover more about the brain and how it works,
Right.
our understanding of intelligence is going to keep changing.
It makes sense. And speaking of other tests,
Yes.
I know there are some other big names besides the Stanford Binet.
There are.
So what else is out there?
Well, one of the most popular ones is the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale,
Okay.
or the WAIS for short.
The WAIS.
Yeah, it's actually the most frequently used intelligence test for adults. And it's based on David Wechsler's view of intelligence,
Right.
which we talked about earlier.
Okay.
It combines that general G factor
Yep.
with the idea that there are distinct abilities.
Okay. So it takes a more blended approach,
It does.
recognizing both that general intelligence and then also the specific areas where people might have strengths.
Exactly. And the WAIS measures these abilities through a bunch of different subtests.
Okay.
Some are verbal and some are performance-based.
What kinds of subtests are we talking about?
Okay, so for the verbal subtests, you're looking at things like vocabulary,
Okay.
similarities, arithmetic skills, digit span, which tests your short-term memory,
Okay.
general knowledge comprehension, and even letter number sequencing.
So those are all about using language and reasoning with words.
Exactly. Then you've got the performance subtests.
Okay.
Those focus on nonverbal problem solving and visual spatial skills.
Okay.
So you might have tasks like picture completion,
Okay.
coding block design, matrix reasoning visual puzzles,
Okay.
figure weights cancellation,
Wow.
symbol search.
That's a lot of different tasks.
It is.
It sounds like the WAIS is really trying to get a full picture of someone's cognitive abilities.
It really is.
It's pretty amazing how much information you can get from these tests.
It is. And on top of all of that,
Yeah.
the WAIS also gives you scores for things like verbal comprehension, perceptual organization, working memory, and processing speed.
Wow.
So you get a very detailed profile.
It's really comprehensive.
It is. Okay, now another test that's widely used is the Kaufman Assessment Battery for Children.
I've heard of that one.
Yeah, or the KABC.
KABC.
Yes, and that one's specifically for kids,
Okay.
ages 2.5 to 12.5.
So it's all about assessing their cognitive development.
Exactly.
What makes the KABC different from other intelligence tests that are designed for children?
Well, it's based on what's called an information processing approach,
Okay.
which focuses on how kids take in information, how they process it,
Right.
and then how they use it.
So it's not just about what they know, but how their brains are actually working.
Exactly.
Okay.
The KABC has 16 subtests.
16.
Yes. And they're grouped into these categories for sequential processing and simultaneous processing.
Can you explain the difference between those two types of processing?
Sure. Think of sequential processing as handling information step by step
Okay.
in a linear way.
Like a recipe.
Yes, exactly like following a recipe
Okay.
or solving a math problem.
Got it.
Okay, now simultaneous processing is more about integrating information from multiple sources all at once. So like putting together a puzzle
Right.
or understanding a complex idea where you need to see the whole picture.
So the KABC looks at both of those cognitive styles.
It does, and it gives you separate scores for each one,
Oh, that's interesting.
which helps identify a child's strengths and weaknesses in those areas.
That seems really useful for educators and parents.
Oh, it is. And it also has a nonverbal scale,
Okay.
which is great for kids who might be hearing impaired or have speech or language disorders or those who don't speak English.
So it's adaptable to different needs and different backgrounds.
Exactly. Okay, let's move on to another one.
Okay.
The Slauson Full Range Intelligence Test,
Okay.
or the SRRT.
The SRRT.
Yeah.
Okay, what's that one all about?
It's a more streamlined test
Okay.
designed to give you a quick estimate of someone's general cognitive ability.
Okay.
It includes verbal performance and memory subtests.
Got it.
And the performance subtest is divided into abstract and quantitative sections.
So it sounds like a quicker assessment than something like the WACE or the KEBC.
It is. It's often used as a screening tool,
Okay.
just to get a general sense of someone's abilities.
Got it.
And then if you need more detailed information, you can use a more comprehensive test.
Like the WACE.
Exactly.
That's kind of a first step.
It is.
Okay, and what of the McCarthy scales of children's abilities?
Oh, yes, the MSCA.
MSCI.
That one's specifically for measuring the general intellectual level of children
Okay.
and identifying their strengths and weaknesses.
Mm-hmm.
It's for kids between the ages of 2 years and 4 months and 8 years and 7 months.
So a similar age range to the KABC?
Yes, very similar.
Okay.
The MSCA uses 18 different subtests.
18.
Yeah, to assess a whole range of skills,
Wow.
including verbal perceptual performance, quantitative memory,
Okay.
and even motor abilities.
It's pretty comprehensive.
It is. And they actually use games and toys as part of the test materials.
That's fun.
It is, which helps keep the kids engaged.
Yeah, that's important when you're working with little kids.
Oh, absolutely. And the MSCA is known for having really strong predictive validity.
Which means...
Which means it does a good job of predicting how well a child will do in school later on.
So it can help identify kids who might need extra help.
Yes.
Or those who are gifted.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got a lot of different intelligence tests out there.
We do.
Each with its own kind of unique features and strength.
They really reflect the complexity of intelligence.
It's fascinating.
It is. And it's important to choose the right test for this situation.
Right.
You have to consider the person's age, their background, and what you're hoping to learn.
It's not one size fits all.
No, it's not.
Okay, well, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive.
We have.
We've talked about different theories of intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
We looked at the Stanford-Binet in detail.
Yes.
We've examined all these other commonly used intelligence tests.
Right.
And we even discussed some of the ethical challenges around testing.
It's been a thorough exploration.
And I think one of the big takeaways here is that intelligence isn't just this one fixed thing.
No, it's not.
It's a lot more complicated than that.
It is. It's multifaceted.
Right. And it involves all these different abilities.
Exactly. And our understanding of it is constantly evolving.
It is as we learn more about the brain and how we think.
So what are some of the areas of research that are shaping our understanding of intelligence today?
Well, one really exciting area is neuroscience.
Okay.
Researchers are using all these brain imaging techniques,
Like what?
things like fMRI,
Okay.
to actually see what's happening in the brain when people are doing things that require intelligence.
So they can watch the brain in action.
They can. And this research is helping us identify the specific brain regions and networks that are involved in different cognitive processes.
Oh, so cool.
It is. It's like we're peeking behind the curtain of the mind.
We are. What else?
Another really interesting area is genetics.
Okay.
Scientists are working to pinpoint specific genes that might contribute to intelligence.
So are you saying that intelligence is hereditary?
Well, it's definitely influenced by genetics.
Okay.
Studies with twins have shown that identical twins,
Who share 100% of their genes,
right,
they tend to have very similar IQ scores,
even if they're raised apart.
even if they're raised apart.
Wow, that's pretty convincing.
It is. But it's important to remember that genes aren't the whole story.
Right.
Your environment plays a huge role in shaping your intelligence as well.
So it's nature versus nurture again?
Exactly. Both our genes and our environment contribute to those cognitive abilities.
Okay, so what are some of the things in our environment that can impact intelligence?
Well, one of the most important factors is early childhood experiences.
Okay.
Those first few years of life are crucial for brain development.
Right.
And having a stimulating environment during those years can have a major impact on cognitive growth.
So access to quality early childhood education is really important.
It's essential. And other things that can play a role include nutrition, healthcare, and even socioeconomic status.
So intelligence isn't just about innate ability.
Right.
It's also shaped by the opportunities and the resources that people have access to.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to address those systemic inequalities that can create barriers for certain groups.
Right. Okay, well, this deep dive has given us a lot to think about.
It has.
We've explored so many different facets of this topic.
Yes.
What are some of the key things that you hope our listener will take away from this conversation?
I hope they'll come away with a better understanding of just how complex intelligence really is, and a greater appreciation for the diversity of human cognitive abilities.
Right.
And I also hope they'll think critically about how intelligence tests are used and interpreted.
Yes.
And really advocate for the responsible and ethical use of these tools.
Absolutely. Because it's important to remember that intelligence isn't fixed.
No, it's not.
It's something that can be developed and nurtured throughout our lives.
It is. With effort and dedication, we can all continue to learn, grow, and expand our minds.
Okay, well, before we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listener with something to ponder.
I'm intrigued.
We've talked about all these different types of intelligence.
We have.
General intelligence, fluid and crystallized intelligence, emotional intelligence, even Gardner's multiple intelligences.
It's a lot.
But is there another type of intelligence that we haven't even considered yet? Something that's uniquely human.
Okay.
Something that sets us apart from other species.
That's a fascinating question.
What do you think? Is there something more to intelligence than what we've discussed so far?
I think there might be.
Oh.
You know, humans have this... The journey of understanding intelligence is far from over.
And I have a feeling there are many more surprises ahead.
I think so, too.
Yeah, it really is a journey.
It is.
And I love that it's still going on.
Me too.
It feels like we're constantly redefining what it even means to be intelligent.
Do you know what's so fascinating to me?
What?
The more we learn about intelligence,
the
more we're actually discovering about ourselves as humans, you
Right,
know?
it's true.
It's like a journey of self-discovery.
It is.
At the same time as it's this scientific exploration.
Yeah, and it's a journey that requires us to be curious.
Of course.
But also critical.
Right.
We have to be open to new ideas.
Yes.
But also be willing to question our own assumptions and biases.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And when you really connect all of this back to the big picture,
Yeah.
you realize that intelligence isn't like a finish line that you cross. You don't just achieve it and then you're done.
Right.
It's this ongoing process.
It is.
Of learning, growing, adapting.
Throughout your whole life.
Your whole life. Exactly.
And it's different for everyone.
Of course. We all have our own strengths and weaknesses.
Of course.
There's own ways of thinking and learning. Our own style. That's why it's so important to celebrate neurodiversity.
Yeah.
And to create environments, you know, whether it's in schools or workplaces,
Right.
that really value all those different ways of thinking.
That makes sense.
Because they're all valuable.
Right. And this makes me think about the future.
Yeah.
As we learn more and more about the brain and human cognition.
Yes.
Are intelligence tests going to change too?
I think they have to.
Yeah.
I think we're going to see a move away from those traditional paper and pencil tests.
Right.
Toward these more dynamic and interactive assessments.
Okay.
Things that can really capture the complexity of intelligence as it plays out in the real world.
So instead of just sitting in a room answering questions, you might be assessed on how well you can collaborate with others.
Exactly.
Or solve problems in the moment.
Yes.
Or adapt to new situations.
Absolutely.
And I imagine technology is going to play a big role in this.
A huge role. We're already seeing the development of virtual reality simulations.
Wow.
And game-based assessments.
Really?
Yeah.
That's so cool.
It is. They can measure cognitive skills in ways that are much more engaging.
Right.
And immersive.
It really feels like the future of intelligence testing is wide open.
It is. And as these tests change and evolve, it's crucial that we're using them responsibly and ethically.
For sure.
You know, being mindful of their limits.
Right.
And never using them to put people in boxes or define their worth.
I completely agree. These tests can be really valuable.
They can.
For helping us understand ourselves and each other.
Absolutely.
But they should never be used to limit anyone's potential.
Couldn't agree more.
Okay. Well, I want to thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the world of intelligence tests.
It's been a pleasure.
And to you, our listener, thank you for listening.
Keep those brains working.
Keep learning. Keep questioning. Keep exploring this amazing landscape of the human mind.
It's an incredible journey.
It is.